Well, Tom, it's good to have our faces on the big screen now. Typically, with our faces for radio, we're typically stuck behind the podcasting desk. It's good to have you here.
Yeah, it's not really nice to be in this very professional-looking studio on the floor at SportsPro Live here. Quite different to our normal tucked away in the corner of a WeWork. So let's maybe I don't know. I got my hair cut especially. Hopefully, it looks all right.
We've finally been given the chance to shine on the biggest stage of all.
Yeah, well, I think we deserve it.
Yeah, I think so too.
Where do you want to start, George?
Well, I know we've been talking about a few things that we wanted to cover, and given that we are at the New Era Open Day at SportsPro Live, I thought it'd be a good place to start with women's sport. So first up, I'm a big cricket fan. Let's talk about the women's IPL.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great place to start, isn't it? Like, it's one of the biggest stories this year, not just in like a business sense, but also like in a women's sports sense, and it goes to kind of show with that kind of property what can be done when it comes to completely rethinking a sport, how you approach it from a women's perspective, and the commercial viability of that business, right?
Yeah, I think the other benefit it has is that it's a centralisation of developments that have taken place in other countries, right? So you're able to pull together resources, particularly from a playing perspective, and you can literally bring the best of the best onto the pitch, and you can get yourself to the highest echelons of the competitive level of that sport. And I think the IPL, from the men's side, has been a commercial powerhouse for years now, and with a lot of sports, with the men and women's equivalent, it can be a case of almost playing catch-up, but my God, the women's IPL, or the WPL as it's now been rebranded to, has started off on a very strong financial footing. So
I think for me, interesting to just start with that branding, right? So if it wanted to just be the women's IPL, it would have called itself the women's IPL, but it actually called itself the Women's Premier League, which in itself is interesting positioning. It's not kind of locating itself in one country, although it is very much based in one country and driven by the interest in cricket in one country. It's calling itself the Women's Premier League because, as you said before, it's taking kind of the best of the best and bringing them all into one place as a central competition, but a central focus, I think, for women's cricket at that point in the calendar. And now that's going to be on an annual basis.
You say at that central point in the calendar, for me it strikes me that it's a great opportunity to do what the men's game is moving towards, inexorably, which is a year-round calendar with centralised contracts for women's players that are attached to different franchises throughout the year and throughout the world. It's an opportunity for certainly the BCCI to set a truly global footprint. And you look at some of the numbers that are being thrown around in terms of player salaries. I think Smriti Mandhana is the highest paid player this year at $430,000. That's for 1 month of playing time. Blows any central contract out of the water. It's probably, and I don't have the figures to hand, but it's at least 2 to 3 times any annual central contract. For a month, there's not going to be a single female player around the world that would turn down that money, and why should they? They have the audience, they have the backing, and I think the BCCI have structured it in a way that has the growth of the property at its heart, and it's incentivising the franchises. So just to look at a bit of the numbers, 80% of the broadcasting revenues are being shared with the franchises for the first 5 years. That figure then drops to 60% for the next 5 years before going down to 50% from years 11 to 15. That's a major, major investment that's being made into these franchises, and it's incentivizing them to say, you've got a great product, let's put the investment behind it, let's put the backing behind it, and let's really see it grow. Same with the licensing. 80% of central licensing. There's $1.5 million that are available to fund squads of 15 to 18 players. There's serious backing here, and I can only see it growing and being a success, and so it should be.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I guess with those kind of the sliding scale of that decrease in central revenue going to the franchises, the idea being that by the time you get to year 10, you get to year 11, that 50-60% is actually going to be worth maybe more than the 80% that they're getting right now. But I'd like to go back to sort of one of the points you talked about earlier, and this being the central point in the calendar and the kind of the competition hub, and rightly should be. that's also because women's cricket is at an interesting position, right? Like women's cricket and the IPL and the men's IPL have struggled with this in that, like, it's got to find its place in an already crowded calendar.
Well, I think it's the opposite.
Well, I know
the calendar now has to find its place amongst an ever-expanding IPL.
No, but like with the Women's Premier League, it can start from that position, and it's not being retroactively fitted into something that's existed for a long time.
That's very true. Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really important point, that as well, because we're not coming. There's no conflict here. You know, the IPL is undoubtedly, you know, the power broker in international cricket, and the BCCI is the power broker. Without them agreeing, decisions aren't made, really. And there's some tension, I think, there. You know, bilateral cricket's becoming under greater stress. We're seeing, I think, a decrease in interest. Certainly my interest has decreased. There's just a gluttony of cricket available to watch. That's not the case in the women's game. I think the trends that we're seeing over the past 5-10 years, that I think is making cricket a better sport, and it's making it certainly a more competitive sport and appealing to the demographics that it needs to in order to survive. That's difficult to fit, as you said, within the current ecosystem. That's just not the case in the women's game. There is an opportunity, there's a platform that has been laid that the the WPL is attaching itself to and can absolutely explode from.
Yeah, and it goes kind of from the top to the bottom of the game too. Like, there's no kind of entrenched thing of like the peak of the women's game is Test cricket, or the peak of the women's game is this. The peak of the women's game is kind of whatever the market says the peak of the women's game is, and that means that you can, like, and that means that, like, young women, girls now playing cricket, they can look at that and go, this is kind of where I want to be. And that is, it's not like the kind of thing where in the men's game you have those conversations around, well, actually I'd still like to play Test cricket, or there's a real push and pull into which way even a player wants to go, and the fans' interest is going, and you've got that real split between younger fans and older fans. Like, you hear enough talk about the 100 from sort of dusty old blokes, the members of the 18 counties here in England, who hate it. Like, they don't understand what it's for. They don't get the purpose of it, and they're maybe coming around to the fact that it works in the women's game, and they don't see it for the men's game. But like that to me is actually an advantage for the women's game. The fact that it's able to be nimble and agile, and can, like, take on these kind of different approaches and embrace them rather than see them as like a problem that's got to be overcome.
I don't want to sound like Stan Kroenke with the announcement of the European Super League, but it doesn't have legacy fans in the same manner that the men's game does. There, you can start from a much more blank slate, and the opportunity to create something truly unique. But not only unique, but one that's actually fit for the modern sports world. Because I think it's pretty clear at this point that, and when we spoke to Jeff Allardyce on this podcast, or on the podcast, on the SportsPro podcast, Jeff was pretty clear that Test cricket and the women's game isn't a natural fit, and it's not one that they're looking to place great emphasis on because it financially just doesn't really work. So there isn't this historical legacy that they have to contend with. It's just simply a rich land of opportunity. And I tuned in for a lot of the games this year, and you know, there's no secret that there's some room to grow. But the level of quality on display and the exciting young talents in particular that are on display, it's just amazing. To think that was just year one, what's coming next for me, I can't wait to see the trajectory that property goes on.
Yeah, and that probably speaks to the interest and the backers that it's got, right? So like the multiple IPL teams that were fighting it out to try and launch a women's franchise and paying not insignificant fees to do so, like that speaks to the opportunity that they see.
The figures are way higher than the men's 100 in the UK. Way higher. The cost per team, the salaries, etc. You know, if you were to hide the banner of what property this is, and you were to quote some of the numbers, to quote the investment that's being made, the infrastructure that's being made, the dedication that's being made to helping this property grow, I don't think you'd have many commentators in the industry that would expect that to be a women's property in the subcontinent.
No, I guess the sort of the thing we've talked around a little bit and not addressed is are there any, like, what problems do you see here? So like, we've talked about the opportunity, we've talked about the finances, we've talked about how this could be potentially really good for the women's game. Is there anything that you see with the WPL that might be that we might look back and go, God, have we opened the Pandora's box on this a little bit?
It's a good question. Nothing that's opening Pandora's box. I think I say it's a challenge, but it's also a great opportunity that they have is women's cricket fan base in India is, I think there's a struggle to attract young girls and women to watch the games. I think that's highlighted by the very noble decision to, I hope that doesn't sound too patronising, but the very noble decision to offer free tickets to women and girls around India to each of the games. That came under actually a lot of criticism within India, but the challenge is how do you turn this property and it doesn't just become the mirror to the men's IPL, right? And there have been efforts to change that, but if you can really engage that female fan base and you can set it aside as a totally different property that has very little connection to the IPL other than the franchise names and the franchise owners, then you've got yourself a rocket ship on your hands.
Do we see that? Do we talk about the positives of this? And the good things it's doing, because we're taking a look at it from oh wow, this would be, if this was in England or if this was in Australia, we'd be lapping this up, and we're sort of seeing in India maybe there's a bit of a reluctance from the fans in India to pick this up. Is that just a state of where India is as a country as opposed to where the market is, do you think?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I also think it is predominantly the cricketing fan as well. There is always especially in cricket more than any other sport, there's a reluctance to change, and there's a reluctance to really embrace these different formats and the shorter formats, because it doesn't have the same level of heritage, I think, and that partly comes from, as you talked about, some of the pale male stale power brokers that have existed previously, and that is changing and in a good way. But what I think is exciting about this is that if I was to suddenly doff my SportsPro cap and put on my ICC cap and I could rebuild cricket from the ground up, this is how I'd be building it.
So no national teams?
No national teams. I think this is not necessarily no national teams, but similar to the football model, where you've got to follow the interest, you've got to follow the audience, and you've got to follow the finances, because otherwise you're always swimming against the tide. And this is where they are. This franchise model is where they are. It's where the sponsors are. It's where the fan base follows. They want to see the best players on the pitch the most amount of times, playing against the best players. You just do not get that in international cricket anymore. There is such a gulf in the finances between the big three and below. You look at women's cricket. Australia, I don't think have lost a series in 2 or 3 years. You know before you start, it's the safest bet you'll ever make that Australia are going to win the Women's World Cup. Because, and rightly that they're doing that, because they invested in professionalism at the earliest stage, and their successes have followed that. And one of the ways to bridge that inequality is, to put up the Smriti Mandanas against the Elise Perrys, against the Nat Sivabrants, against the Ishmaels from South Africa. You're getting the best players on the pitch, and it's only going to bring the audiences with them. It's exciting to watch.
Yeah, I agree with you to an extent, but I also think that the ICC couldn't as a global governing body, I don't think it can completely ignore the fact that this will if you pursue that model to the sort of nth degree, and you completely ignore the international model, that you lose an opportunity to grow, to grow the games in different places in different ways. So just to sort of let me finish that point,
you can already see I'm desperate to jump in there. There's a passionate point of mine, Tom.
I can see. I'm just waiting for the barbed response I'm going to get in return.
No, not barbed. For the beauty of the game.
It's chucked me off my monologue already.
Sorry.
But to come back to that, so at the international level, I think actually it's good to have creative tension. So good to have the ICC now having there's this new thing in women's cricket. And if we want international women's cricket to stay relevant and remain something that is important to us, and keep an interest in the Women's World Cup, keep an interest in the T20 Women's World Cup, having those different narratives in a sport, I think, are important. I think it's you can't just have rinse and repeat the same thing, the same players competing in slightly different makeups of 11s in different kits. But if you put something behind that, and like that's what's really compelling about the World Cup in football, is that you're changing, you're taking players out of context and you're putting them in a completely different context. So if the ICC...
That's exactly the answer. The World Cup in football is exactly the answer. You put your T20 World Cups in there, you put your 50 over World Cups in there, potentially at a push you reintroduce something like the Champions Trophy that exists, and they're these tentpole moments, right? They're these coming togethers of these different players that, you know, teammates, great teammates in the franchise leagues who are now going head to head. You know, they know each other's games and so that's. They're the narratives that get people talking. They're the narratives that get people tuning in. But, you know, watching Australia complete their 5-0 clean sweep of England or of Sri Lanka in a bilateral series that is essentially two dead rubbers after 7 days of sport, you're not going to bring in your big audiences there. And you know, creating as much competitive tension as you can, I think, is pretty unanimously agreed to be the blueprint for success when it comes to building a sports property. And the WPL is the best and closest way you're going to get there, because there's still a reluctance of these big cricketing boards that are in serious financial strife themselves on the men's side. Serious financial strife, particularly post-COVID-19. You're just not going to get the level of required investment that's going to close that gap anytime soon. This is the closest way to do it.
So sort of to wrap up this conversation a little bit then, so let's spin forward like 5 years.
Yeah.
How do you think women's international women's cricket as an ecosystem should look? Are we talking about you've got those tentpole moments still, you've got those national team tournaments, but punctuating the calendar, you've got the Women's Premier League, you've got the 100 if it survives, you've got and you've got similar competitions, similar T20 or 50 over competitions dotted around the globe where you get those chances to see that. Is that the vision you're projecting for women's cricket?
It's a good question. When you say the 100 if it survives, for me the only way the 100 does survive is if those franchises are put up for sale, and inevitably, if history is anything to go by, they will be purchased by the 9 or 10 franchises that exist in the men's IPL, 5 of which have been transferred into the Women's Premier League. So the way I see it is that the WPL dominates, and that there may be, you know, 2 to 3 leagues around the world, potentially one in the UK, one in Australia, one in India, or maybe South Africa you include in there as well, and that there is some form of continuity between those tournaments. So whether that is a continuation of the league, the first third is played in India, or probably more likely the first 2/3 is played in India, with the last third dotted around those different countries, or you have international games in the style of the NBA in places like the UK or South Africa and Australia. And then, because cricket is much more limited, given the importance of the weather in how it can be played, you'd have the WPL that takes place for 6 months of the year through an Indian summer, and then, or through an Indian winter, actually, I suppose, given the temperatures, and you would then have, let's say, a tournament which brings all the international teams together via like a Nations League type thing, with a final showpiece, and that would be dotted around the globe throughout the year, or throughout a 4-year cycle. Maybe 1 year it's in England, 1 year it's in South Africa, 1 year it's in Sri Lanka, wherever that might be, and that is an ability to keep the international game relevant.
Just one thing, I think, before we completely finish on that. So there was one notable country missing in that worldwide roster of events, and that's the US. Do you think there's any place for the US in that ecosystem?
Well, Major League Cricket launches this summer in the US, and it's an untested. It's not untested, but it's an untested water when it comes to live events. We heard from Jeff Allardyce on the pod previously. We've heard from Finn, head of digital at the ICC as well, Finn Bradshaw, head of digital at the ICC, about how America is an important strategic growth market for the ICC. I think if we see something like Major League Cricket, performing really well, we see the T20 World Cup going to the US and the Caribbean in a couple of years' time. If we see success there, I see no reason why that country isn't added to the calendar, but there's no need to at the moment yet. I think it's really, it's the ability to be agile depending on how successful the men's game is there. And that's one of the real, unfair advantages. It's weird to use the word unfair when it comes to women's sports, but it is one of the unfair advantages that women's sports has, is that it doesn't need to follow the men's blueprint, it doesn't have so much of that baggage. It can almost use that as a testing ground to see, are the fans coming, in venue in the same way they might be attracting onto the digital platforms? And if they are, then great. There's no need to fit this into an already packed schedule, because they can control the schedule as it is.
All right, mate. Lovely stuff. Let's wrap it up there.
Right, that's cricket solved. Cheers, Tom.